The Anti-Chinese Campaigns in Sonora, Mexico, by Dennis A. Phillip of the Texas Tech University. Published 1979. In September 1931, most of the Chinese population of Sonora, Mexico was expelled from the state, following a long series of bitter anti-Chinese campaigns. The events in Sonora have parallels in the experience of the overseas Chinese in other parts of the world, and provide an interesting case history of intergroup conflict and racial prejudice. In an earlier paper dealing with the same events, Kreutz tries to develop a general theory of the role of the overseas Chinese in economic development. In this paper, my aim is a bit more modest. I will try to briefly summarize the history of the Chinese in Sonora, describe the anti-Chinese campaigns and the expulsion, and then turn to the vicious anti-Chinese propaganda of the time. I will make reference to the anti-Chinese campaigns elsewhere in an attempt to make clear the historical dynamics of the situation. However, as an anthropologist, my primary interest is in the way negative symbols of group identity were used in social conflict, and in the role of ethnicity versus social class in the conflict process. In the last part of the paper, I will discuss these issues and make some comparisons with recent political events in the same area. The data in the paper comes primarily from documentary sources, newspaper accounts, the published works of Charles Cumberland, Gordon Kreutz, and Leo Jacques, and various unpublished anti-Chinese documents in the University of Arizona Library. In addition, 2 long interviews were conducted with an elderly Chinese woman in Tucson, Arizona, who lived in the Guianas throughout the whole persecution and expulsion period. In general, I see the complementary use of informants, accounts, and documentary sources as a technique characteristic of ethnohistory in interpreting the cultural experiences of peoples studied by anthropologists. The Chinese in Sonora. The bulk of the Chinese population in northwest Mexico arrived after 1893, following a treaty of amity and commerce between Mexico and China, which gave the Chinese the status of immigrants from the most favored nation. The Diaz government of the time viewed cheap Chinese labor as useful in the country's economic development. The same sort of most favored nation status had also been accorded to Chinese immigrants in the United States by the Burlingame Treaty of 1868. A Mazatlan newspaper of 1893 describes the arrival of a group of Chinese in that port. Sad and silent they came ashore, as if longing for their home country. They came in lamentable state of poverty, to judge by their miserable clothes and ruined physique, perhaps due to anemia or tuberculosis, walking in single file with their head down, mostly barefoot. They seem like a crowd of miserable slaves just escaped from the galleys. They cramp down on the beach. Several Chinamen already established in their city bring them rations of rice. They come to work, according to their countrymen who live among us, as peons on the railway constructions of the South Pacific lines, and among the newcomers are to be found good cooks, magnificent laundrymen, and clothes ironers. The vagabond boys on the beach make fun of the newcomers. They laugh at their pigtails, their slant eyes, their strange dirty color. But the Chinamen only respond to the cruel jokes with an innocent smile and an intelligent wink of the eyes. Espinosa, a leading anti-Chinese propagandist, used the above description in a negative context. From a different, non-racist viewpoint, we see people of a different culture, desperately poor, suddenly left on the beach among strangers, thousands of miles from home. Their future achievements seem even more remarkable. Eager to seize new economic opportunities, one ill-fated group of Sonoran Chinese gave the Desierto de los Chinos in northern Baja California its name. They had arrived in Mazatlan in 1900 and found little work. In 1902, word arrived that agricultural workers were needed in Mexicali, and about 50 Chinese promptly set out. They walked to Guaymas, waited to get deck passage on a boat across the Gulf to San Felipe, and finally started across the desert from San Felipe to Mexicali. Because of an incompetent Mexican guide and their own ignorance of the country, all but 7 died on the trip. When cotton was introduced to the Mexicali Valley a few years later, around 5,000 Chinese laborers were brought to work in the fields. They organized cooperative associations to lease the land and produce a crop, each member contributing toward the initial investment and sharing the profit of each harvest. 80% of the Mexicali cotton crop up to 1923 had been produced this way by the Chinese. When the cotton market collapsed in 1920, however, many of these Chinese drifted to other parts of Mexico or went back to China. The numbers of the Chinese in northwest Mexico were never very large. A U.S. Commerce Department report of 1923 estimates the West Coast Chinese population at 3,500, with the largest colonies at Guaymas and Mazatlan. Nevertheless, by the 1920s they had come to control a large part of Sonora's commerce and small business. From penniless laborers, the Chinese had become prosperous businessmen. Espinosa lists 20 large industries, 30 tailor shops, 50 bakeries, 72 restaurants, 36 hotels, 80 laundries, 50 meat markets, 14 sweatshops, and 13 cantinas run by the Chinese in the state. Some indications of their prosperity can be seen from the fact that their losses were estimated at $10 million when they were expelled in 1931. Withdrawal of the Chinese deposits at that time caused the Bank of Sonora to close. In 1931, the total number of Chinese in Sonora is variously estimated from 3,000 to 12,000, although the 3,000 figure is probably closer to the truth. Since the early revolutionary years, there had been anti-Chinese incidents and sporadic anti-Chinese campaigns all over northern Mexico. In Torreon, in 1910, over 300 Chinese were killed in the bloodiest incident. In 1918, 527 Chinese returned to El Paso with Pershing's expedition to escape from persecution in Chihuahua. Realista troops, in particular, looked at the Chinese as fair game, and stores were looted and Chinese beaten and killed in Guaymas, Hermosillo, Nacozari, Nogales, and elsewhere. Cumberland, relying primarily on U.S. consular reports, pieces together the events leading to the 1931 expulsion. Following the revolution, legal actions began against the Chinese. With Plutarco Elías Calles as president in 1927, the treaty with China was cancelled. In Sonora, beginning in 1923, segregation laws were passed restricting the Chinese to certain sections of cities and prohibiting marriage or concubinage between Mexicans and Chinese. These discretionary laws were generally not enforced, but they were used by Mexican local authorities to extract money from the Chinese population. Anti-Chinese political organizations were active in Sonora during the 1920s. Under the leadership of such figures as Jose Maria Arana, they distributed racist tracts, inflamed public opinion, and worked for legal sanctions against the Chinese. Propagandists such as Jose Angel Espinosa wrote anti-Chinese literature, some of which remains in the University of Arizona Library. Pictured is a drawing from one of Espinosa's tracts, showing Orania addressing a Sonora crowd. Beside him is a Mexican flag, and the slogan of his podium reads, "Mexican, of every peso that you pay a Chinaman, 50 centavos goes to Shanghai, and the other 50 centavos goes to enslave you and prostitute the women of your race." In 1929, the Great Depression hit, and Mexican laborers came flooding back into Sonora from the United States. They found Chinese everywhere, prosperous and controlling jobs and wealth they themselves wanted. With the new support from the jobless, the anti-Chinese campaigns intensified, and a new set of discriminatory laws was passed. 80% of all employees in businesses were to be Mexican. No miscegenation was to be permitted. Food and other items could not be sold in the same store, and no residence could also be a store. For the first time, there were serious attempts to enforce these laws. In particular, the 80% Mexican employment law. The expulsion, which began on August 1931, is described in a series of articles in the New York Times and the Arizona Daily Star. On August 30th, the Times reported that the Sonoran Chinese had been given until September 5th to leave the state. An order by Governor Rodolfo Elías Calles forced the Chinese to liquidate their holdings and leave, either through the U.S. border points or to the south through the port of Mazatlan. The U.S. agreed to allow the refugees to pass through the country to San Francisco under bond, and groups of Chinese began leaving Nogales bound for China. Jails in Bisbee, Douglas, Nogales, and Tucson were for a time crowded with Chinese awaiting passage. Some of the refugees may have remained in the U.S. or gone to other parts of Mexico, but most apparently did return to China. One newspaper article describes a group of 180 refugees in San Francisco en route to Canton. The article mentions that 60% of those expelled were unable to pay for their own passage and were trying to secure financial assistance from the Chinese government. On September 4th, the governor granted an extension of the expulsion deadline, and a stream of emigrants slowed down. However, given the political situation, the Chinese continued to leave the state until, by early 1932, most had gone. At least 3,000 Chinese had been expelled, many of them reduced to poverty. There were relatively little bloodshed considering the extent of anti-Chinese feelings, but the refugees were harassed and insulted at every step. For instance, some were stripped of their clothing by Mexican border guards. in addition to paying a 50 peso exit fee per person. The aftermath of the Chinese expulsion was devastating. According to the Daily Star, published September 5, 1931, the Qingchang Company of Navoye suffered a 500,000 peso loss, and a man named Niao Wo of Nogales was forced to sacrifice a 250,000 peso business. General estimates put the loss at $10 million, although some of the Chinese did manage to withdraw their bank deposits, and in some cases, apparently, to send the money on ahead to San Francisco. Many Chinese homes and businesses were broken into, their contents looted, and their inhabitants forced into the street. Ironically, the Chinese businesses had contributed a large part of the state's income tax, and, following their expulsion, the state government of Sonora almost went bankrupt. Sonora recovered slowly from the successful expulsion of its hated Chinese population, who had apparently been the mainstay of the economy. Interviews. To complement the documentary materials, 2 interviews were held with an elderly Chinese woman who lived in Guaymas, Sonora, throughout the persecution period. She came to Guaymas from Hong Kong in 1927 at the age of 18 and lived there until 1949. Her father had been working in Guaymas and had met a young man there who wanted a wife. Thus, the marriage with his daughter, still in Hong Kong, was arranged in more or less traditional Chinese fashion. When she arrived, however, their marriage was celebrated in the local Mexican style, with several days of music, feasting, and drinking, and many important citizens and officials of Guaymas present. Her husband was a highly successful vegetable wholesaler by the time of the expulsion order given in 1931. He and his wife had become Mexican citizens and had many influential compadres or friends in Guaymas. For example, he was a leader of the local Masonic order. Furthermore, he identified with his adopted country. He was a pure Mexican, says his wife. Very caprichudo. Here I stay, or here I will die. My life is here and not in China. He had no fear of anyone. Are you better than me? Who are you to throw me out? I am a man. Strapping on his pistol, he would go to unload crates of vegetables from the train at night, and everyone would call out to him by name. During the expulsion period, an influential lawyer wrote him a document stating that he was a citizen and asking him to be treated as such. It was through the efforts of such friends that he and his family lived through the persecution, although they lost everything they had saved. As a believer in his adopted country, my informant's husband refused to withdraw his money from the Bank of Sonora when everyone else was withdrawing. He lost 50,000 pesos when the bank closed following the Chinese exodus. For 3 years, the family, once prosperous, lived in a small, unlighted room lent them by a friend. My informant would take her 2 children by the hand to school each day and bring them back, since otherwise they were exposed to hurled rocks and to other insults and abuse, and she feared for their safety. Little by little, the family began selling fruits and vegetables again, and eventually regained some measure of prosperity. They moved to the US following their son's marriage to an American woman in 1949. In spite of the hardships and persecution she suffered, my informant's positive attitude toward Mexico and her life there is impressive. The expulsion she blames on one single villain, Governor Calles, and not on the general populace of Sonora. She reminisces nostalgically about her many close Mexican friends. Today, most of her friendships are with Mexican Americans in the South Tucson area, and not with the Tucson Chinese, who come from elsewhere. Her husband represents one extreme of the Chinese adaptation to Sonora, the successful culture broker, with ties to the Chinese community through birth, but with stronger ties to the surrounding Mexican population. Although he could not change his Chinese appearance, he apparently lived as a Mexican. He was an exception to the generalizations about non-assimilating overseas Chinese. Anti-Chinese propaganda. The basic complaint against the Chinese during the whole persecution period was that they represented unfair economic competition. Kreutz presents the situation of the overseas Chinese in general in the following terms. They came as workers to meet the demand for labor in difficult, often dangerous work, far from families and at the lowest possible wages. Over 3 million people from the provinces of Guangdong and Fujian emigrated to Southeast Asia, the United States, Mexico, Peru, and elsewhere in the world during the 19th century. The general Chinese expectations seemed to have been to escape poverty at home, work hard, save money to support kinsmen in China, and if possible, to return home oneself. The Chinese work ethic made them ideal laborers. They were hardworking, venturesome, frugal, and had the willingness to get ahead through delayed gratification. Economic development plans were built around cheap Chinese labor, often backfired, however, as the Chinese branched out into various kinds of commerce and outcompeted local businessmen. At this point, sharp reaction against them developed, and anti-Chinese movements appeared in California, in Mexico, and elsewhere. In Texas, Rhodes argues that the concentration of the Chinese population in urban Chinatowns was really a response to the prosecution and discrimination encountered in rural areas where they had originally found employment. Crowded together in Chinatowns, the Chinese could deal more easily with the surrounding society, as well as pursuing the economic opportunities available in the city. This broad pattern of Chinese emigration, anti-Chinese reaction, and Chinese response to discrimination is important for understanding the Sonoran case. Purely historical accounts, such as that of Cumberland, suffer from neglecting the world context in which such events occurred. In California, the anti-Chinese campaigns have been well described by Sandmeyer, Wu, Lehman, and others. Comparisons with the Sonoran case are abundant. For example, in both areas, legislation was used as a punitive, discriminatory pressure device. In San Francisco, in the 1870s, ordinances were passed to force Chinese to cut their hair, since the pigtails, or kuiwei, as well as being outlandish from the American point of view, was a symbol of loyalty to the Manchu government. To charge higher license fees for hand-drawn than that of horse-drawn laundry carts, thus discriminating against the Chinese, and to prevent the Chinese from disinterring their dead for shipment back to China. An amusing victory for the Chinese occurred when arrests were made for violation of the Cubic Air Ordinance of 1870, which required that every lodging have at least 500 cubic feet of airspace for each adult. The Chinese refused to pay bail or fines, pointing out that the jails in which they were confined violated the ordinance. In California, most of the discriminatory ordinances were eventually struck down by higher courts, but in Sonora, the anti-Chinese laws became the legal basis for expulsion. The law in both areas was used as the punitive arm of the state, a perfectly legal tool for oppressing hated minority groups. In Sonora, the general feeling was that the Chinese represented the quintessence of the businessman impossible to compete with. Against his frugality, his stinginess, his cooperation with his countrymen, against outsiders, there is no defense. The Chinese were said to have lived on rice and tea in quarters no civilized men could inhabit, and devote their whole life to personal gain. Give a Chinaman anything but tea and rice, and his body ceases to function, just as if you were to put water in the gas tank of a car. Furthermore, the Chinese were seen as depriving local people of jobs and sending the money earned out of the country back to China, i.e., as profiteering at the expense of the local population. With their economic power, the Chinese were accused of bribing local authorities and thus gaining special privileges for themselves. As anti-Chinese campaigns grew, however, their focus often changed from economic competition to alleged racial and cultural inferiority. The Chinese contributed to this view by themselves expressing a stance of cultural superiority and non-contact with surrounding communities. The inwardly oriented local Chinese community easily became an object of scorn and hostility. Some interesting data on the anti-Chinese attitudes comes from José Ángel Espinosa's propaganda. Espinosa's racial accusations against the Chinese range from their alleged lack of muscular strength and supposed effeminateness to the terrible effects of miscegenation with Mexicans. In an amusing passage, Espinosa says that the first Chinese to arrive in the Northwest were not attractive to women since they were seen with the natural repulsion of the Mexican woman towards effeminate men. Since the Chinamen, washing clothes and plucking chickens, seemed like authentic queers, occupied with the work of the weaker sex, they lacked only skirts. Chinese contracts with Mexican women became a major focus for the campaign. The Chinese were accused of luring poor Mexican women into prostitution, which they accompanied by first replacing women as cooks, dishwashers, and cleaners. With no honest work left to do, and many poor women left as widows from the revolution, were forced to become prostitutes in Chinese brothels, according to Espinosa. Mexican women who married Chinese and had children sufficed an equally terrible fate. Their children are portrayed as scabby, retarded, miserable creatures, and their Chinese husbands as cruel, jealous masters. One of Espinosa's drawings shows a Chinese man with two ragged, perspiring women yoked to a plow. Chinese culture takes some equally hard blows. The Tongs were said to be the true Chinese government, delivering judgment and engaging in bloody warfare, and making a mockery of the laws of the country in which they lived. Chinese cooking and living habits were said to be filthy, and the Chinese were accused of transmitting diseases ranging from trachoma to syphilis or leprosy. In their restaurant kitchens, they have various receptacles, generally covered with filth, where they deposit all the scraps left on plates by customers, only to return it all, newly heated, to the next customer who arrives. The Chinese make sausages of dogs, cats, rats, and other animals. Similarly, Chinese music was said to be a combination of cats howling, frogs croaking, and crickets chirping. The stereotype of the Chinese presented in Espinosa's book and summarized by Cumberland is of a dirty, unhealthy gambler addicted to opium and existing on a starvation diet, who is grasping and avaricious, exploits Mexican women, and produces skinny, diseased offspring, and who kills his countrymen in mysterious, bloody Tong wars. Espinosa proves to be an outstanding example of the racist psychology. Any argument that can be made, he makes. Don't the Chinese exemplify the virtues of Confucianism? Espinosa argues that they don't really live by them. In fact, they make a farce of them. Aren't the Chinese mild and submissive and inoffensive? Actually, they kill each other constantly in bloody Tong wars. Negative symbols of group identity. Cumberland, a historian, has several interesting suggestions about this virulent propaganda. Mexicans resented, for example, the neutrality of the Chinese during the Revolutionary years, and especially the great Chinese business success, which, from the Mexican point of view, amounted to profiteering. The Chinese were regarded as unwilling to take part in constructive political activities, but willing to exercise political influence to keep their own profitable businesses operating. Food handlers in general, and Chinese in particular, tended to be blamed for epidemic diseases, which were common in Mexico during and after the Revolution. And this fact may help explain the accusations of poor hygiene. Most important, of course, Cumberland recognizes that the Chinese were an easily identified scapegoat for Sonora's economic problems. From the anthropologist's point of view, perhaps the most interesting thing about this propaganda is the way in which racial and cultural differences became focal symbols for hostility, and how effective these focal symbols were in arousing popular feeling. The Sonoran anti-Chinese campaigns were, after all, successful in completely driving out the Chinese. We may make an interesting anti-Marxist observation here. In spite of great economic power, the Chinese were unable to defend themselves successfully in the political sphere. Economic power did not seem to bring corresponding political power. Chinese defense organizations were active and may have succeeded in murdering their enemy Jose Maria Arana. However, their wealth, their favor with particular government officials, and their occasional success against enemies like Arana were not able to stem the tide of anti-Chinese feelings or to prevent the final expulsion. In this case, Chinese racial and cultural differences, which served as negative symbols of group identity, seemed to play a powerful role in the conflict process. To examine the role of these symbols in intergroup conflict, I would like to make some comparisons with recent events in the same area. Conflict in Sonora and neighboring Sinaloa was again widely publicized in 1976. Laborers on giant agro-business farms there demanded land for themselves, and large-scale violence seemed imminent when former President Luis Echeverria granted land to them in the face of opposition from the large landowners. Later, the Mexican Supreme Court canceled the land grants, and the current situation seems uncertain. The anti-Chinese campaigns of the 1920s, like the recent events, represent to some degree a class struggle. The Chinese, who had come as a poor and non-threatening proletariat, had made themselves into a prosperous bourgeois class of businessmen and storekeepers. By the 1920s, they were regarded as monopolizing Sonoran trade and commerce, and the patriotic campaigns against them were aimed at allowing disadvantaged Mexicans equal opportunities for jobs and wealth. To some extent, the conflict represented poor Mexicans against wealthy Chinese. The Chinese of the 1920s, like the landowners of today, were seen as a class of privileged overlords against whom the masses of poor working-class Mexicans could be aroused. The major difference in the two situations is that in the 1920s, Chinese were also attacked because they were culturally and racially different. Espinosa's vicious anti-Chinese propaganda, while acknowledging that of the economic conflict was primary, nevertheless shifts quickly to such supposed distinctive Chinese practices as gambling, opium smoking, cruelty to women, Tong warfare, and so on. The way of life of people as culturally distinct as the Chinese provides a negative focus around which hostility can be easily generated. Here we see the opposite side of Edward Spicer's crucial symbols of group identity. Spicer suggested that certain sets of crucial symbols define a people's way of life for themselves and allow it to be carried on through generations even when surrounded by a different and hostile cultural group. Thus, such symbols such as a sacred land, a common language, legendary heroes, and various kinds of music and dance have constituted persistent identity systems for groups such as the Yaquis, the Basques, and the Irish. In the overseas Chinese case, however, we find negative symbols in the group's deviation from proper behavior, which identify it within the general population as a target group for hostility. Sets of crucial symbols may, in other words, give a group a kind of negative identity and subject it to persecution. Ironically, the identity symbols which generate hostility may be seen very differently by the target group themselves. In this case, it is not likely that such things as unclean food preparation and abuse of Mexican women formed part of Chinese self-conception. Spicer's crucial symbols of identity refer to a group's self-image, whereas other symbols may identify the groups negatively from the viewpoint of the surrounding population. The 1920s saw, then, an inter-ethnic struggle masking an underlying class conflict. I suggest that it is easier to generate class conflict when radical cultural differences separate the groups involved. The class consciousness necessary for conflict is in fact halfway created in situations where crucial cultural symbols identify the opposed class groups. Antagonism, which is rooted in economic inequality, can be magnified and sustained by emphasizing unnatural and outlandish traits. In Sonora, the Mexican working man may have found it impossible to identify with pigtailed, opium-smoking Chinese, whereas today he may find it easy to identify with an upper-class landowner who leads the sort of life that he would like to lead himself. In other words, Chinks, Chalets, and Sons of Confucius make good targets. If the current struggle against landowning upper class in Sonora and Sinaloa does not succeed, perhaps it will be related to the absence of cultural differences which might be used as hostility generators.